The waltz, echoing through the grand ballroom of the Pendleton estate, was meant to be celebratory, but to Genevieve Laurent it sounded like a funeral dirge. She sat completely still in a high-backed velvet chair near the terrace doors, half swallowed by the shadows. The cold draughts of the autumn night seeped through the glass wrapping around her shoulders. She wore a somber dark blue dress. It was an expensive garment, but cut so modestly and colored so severely that it functioned perfectly as a shroud. That was the point. For 4 years, the Pendleton family had dressed her, paraded her, and positioned her to look exactly like what they wanted the world to see, a broken, fragile, useless woman. Tonight was the eve of her 30th birthday. In exactly 4 hours at midnight, she would officially reach the age stipulated in her late father's will. But there was no birthday cake in this room. There were no toasts to her health. The elite of the city had gathered under the massive crystal chandeliers, not to celebrate her, but to witness her final erasure. Across the polished marble floor, the center of attention was a man who legally held her name, yet had never been a husband to her. Arthur Pendleton laughed, holding a flute of champagne. He was undeniably handsome in his bespoke tuxedo, but his features possessed a heavy, arrogant quality that wealth could not quite refine. He looked entirely at ease, completely ignoring the woman sitting in the shadows, who had provided the very roof over his head. He was not alone. Clinging to his arm, radiant in a backless silver gown, was Clara. Clara was Arthur's public secret. She was young, vibrant, and possessed the kind of loud, confident laughter that commanded a room. The high society guests, the politicians, the corporate board members, they all knew. They saw Arthur kissing Clara's cheek. They saw his hand resting intimately on her waist. And they saw Genevieve sitting in the corner, a silent ghost in her own house. The whispers drifted toward Genevieve, like dry leaves on a bitter wind. "Look at her," a woman in emerald silk murmured behind a feathered fan just loud enough to be heard. "She hasn't spoken a word all night. I hear she's completely lost her mind." "It's a pity," a grey-haired banker replied, his eyes filled with mock sympathy. "Arthur has carried the burden of the Laurent estate entirely on his shoulders. He deserves a little happiness. The poor girl is just a shell." Genevieve did not flinch. Her breathing remained perfectly controlled, shallow and even. She kept her hands folded in her lap, her pale fingers resting over the heavy gold signet ring on her left hand. It bore the Pendleton crest. It was a brand of shackles she had worn for 4 agonizing years. Suddenly the music faded. The string quartet stopped playing as Arthur stepped up to the grand staircase, tapping a silver spoon against his crystal glass. The room fell into an expectant hush. "Ladies and gentlemen," Arthur began, his voice projecting with practiced charm. "Thank you for joining us tonight. As you know, we are gathered to celebrate the future. A future of prosperity, growth, and unparalleled success for our combined enterprises." He smiled warmly, looking down at Clara, who beamed up at him from the bottom step. He did not look at Genevieve, not once. To mark this occasion, Arthur continued, reaching into his breast pocket. "I want to present a token of my deep appreciation to the woman who has been my anchor." He pulled out a long velvet box and opened it. The chandelier light caught the fire of a breathtaking diamond necklace. A collective gasp of admiration rippled through the ballroom. Arthur stepped down, moving behind Clara, and fastened the diamonds around her neck. She laughed a bright, triumphant sound and turned to kiss him squarely on the mouth. The room erupted into applause. They were applauding the public humiliation of a wife on the eve of her own birthday. They were clapping for the erasure of Genevieve Laurent. In her dark corner, Genevieve's nails pressed into her palms, carving deep, crescent-shaped marks into her skin. The physical pain grounded her. It kept the rage perfectly bottled behind her dark, impenetrable eyes. "It suits her much better than it would have suited you." The voice was venomous, laced with the scent of expensive gin and heavy floral perfume. Lady Beatrice Pendleton stepped out of the crowd and into the shadows towering over Genevieve's chair. Arthur's mother was a terrifying force of high society cruelty, dressed in stark black, her eyes glittering with malice. Genevieve did not look up. She kept her gaze fixed on the marble floor. Beatrice leaned down her lips, brushing close to Genevieve's ear. Her whisper was a razor blade, disguised as silk. "The clock is ticking, my dear," Beatrice murmured. "It is 8 o'clock. You have exactly 4 hours until midnight. Arthur will be waiting in the library when the guests leave." Genevieve's jaw locked. She did not speak. Do not test my patience tonight! Beatrice hissed, her fingers gripping the back of Genevieve's velvet chair with sudden violence. You will sign the medical proxy and the asset transfer documents. You will sign over the autonomous title. If you refuse, a private ambulance is waiting at the back gate. 2 doctors who owe me very large favors have already signed the paperwork declaring you mentally unfit. You will spend the rest of your pathetic life in a padded room, and Arthur will take control of your estate anyway. Beatrice straightened her posture, smoothing her dress. The choice is yours. Sign your name, and you may live out your days quietly in the countryside. Refuse, and you simply cease to exist. Enjoy the party, Genevieve. The older woman turned and walked back into the glittering light, seamlessly joining a conversation with the senator, laughing, as if she had not just threatened to destroy a woman's life. Genevieve sat alone in the cold air. The applause had died down. The waltz had resumed. She did not cry. Tears were a currency she had run out of 3 years ago. Slowly, deliberately, her right hand moved up to her chest. She pressed her palm flat against the high collar of her dark blue dress. Beneath the heavy fabric resting directly against her heart was a hard, cold object. A brass skeleton key. Her father's key. The only tangible proof of the inheritance they had spent 4 years trying to steal. Genevieve looked across the room at Arthur, who was pouring more champagne for Clara. He looked invincible. He thought she was broken. He thought she was entirely defeated. Her dark eyes narrowed, a freezing, dangerous calm settling over her features. She looked down at the Pendleton ring on her finger one last time. 4 hours, she thought, the silence in her mind sharper than any scream. 4 hours until I take back my name. The grand ballroom emptied slowly, the laughter and clinking glasses fading into the cavernous silence of the Pendleton estate. The performance was over. The elite guests stepped out into the crisp autumn night, slipping into their town cars, completely oblivious to the nightmare they were leaving behind. The moment the massive front doors clicked shut, the charming, charismatic smile vanished from Arthur's face. It melted away, replaced by the heavy, irritable sneer that Genevieve knew all too well. He did not look at Clara, who was already heading upstairs with a glass of champagne in hand, her new diamond necklace catching the dim hall light. Instead, Arthur turned his watery blue eyes toward the shadows, where his wife still sat. Get up, he snapped. The command was cold, devoid of any pretense of warmth. Genevieve rose slowly. The heavy dark blue fabric of her dress whispered against the marble floor. She kept her spine perfectly straight, her chin level. She did not speak. Arthur closed the distance between them, his hand shooting out to grip her upper arm. His fingers dug into her skin through the silk, hard enough to leave a bruise, but careful not to break the fabric. He practically dragged her down the long, dimly lit corridor that led to the west wing. The only sounds were his heavy, impatient footsteps and the quiet, steady click of her heels. He shoved her into the estate's private library, a massive room lined with floor-to-ceiling mahogany bookshelves that smelled of aged paper, expensive cigars, and stale whiskey. These books belonged to her grandfather. The leather armchairs belonged to her father, but Arthur stood in the center of the room, as if he had built it all himself. He walked over to the massive oak desk, yanked open a drawer, and pulled out a manila folder. He threw it onto the polished surface. The heavy paper slapped against the wood with the crack of a whip. Sit down, Arthur ordered, pointing to the leather chair opposite the desk. Genevieve did not sit. She remained standing near the door, a striking silhouette of quiet defiance. Her dark, impenetrable eyes stared blankly at the folder. I said sit down, Genevieve, Arthur growled, pouring himself a generous measure of scotch from a crystal decanter. When she still did not move, he scoffed, taking a long drink. Fine. Stand. It won't change what is about to happen. He opened the folder and smoothed out the documents inside. These are medical proxy forms and a full transfer of asset management, Arthur said, tapping the paper with a heavy gold pen. They stipulate that due to your deteriorating mental condition, you are voluntarily surrendering the autonomous title of Duchess of Laurent, along with full administrative control of the estate to me, your legal guardian. He looked up at her, waiting for a reaction. A sob. A plea. A collapse. He had spent 4 years chipping away at her sanity, locking her in her room, intercepting her mail, firing any servant who spoke kindly to her. He expected her to shatter. Genevieve gave him nothing. She simply looked at the paper, then shifted her gaze to his face. The absolute stillness of her posture was unnatural. It was not the stillness of a terrified prey animal. It was the chilling, expensive stillness of a bomb waiting to detonate. Arthur shifted his weight, suddenly uncomfortable under her dark, unwavering stare. He hated that look. He had always hated it. It was the only thing about her he had never been able to break. "Don't look at me like that!" He snapped, his voice rising in volume. "This is for your own good. You are a ghost, Genevieve. You wander these halls looking like a corpse. You can't handle the responsibilities of the Laurent Empire. I have carried this burden for 4 years. The board knows it. The banks know it. I've doubled your family's portfolio while you've sat in the dark, staring at the walls." It was a lie, of course. The forged documents on the desk were an act of sheer desperation. Arthur hadn't doubled the portfolio. He had bled it dry to fund his political ambitions and Clara's expensive tastes. If Genevieve legally took control at midnight on her 30th birthday, the estate's auditors would find the massive black holes in the accounts. Arthur wasn't trying to save her. He was trying to stay out of federal prison. "Sign the damn paper," Arthur demanded, thrusting the gold pen toward her. "Sign it, and my mother will ensure you have a quiet cottage in the countryside. You can live out your days in peace. I will even ensure you are kept comfortable." Genevieve did not step forward. She did not reach for the pen. Her silence hung in the room, thick and suffocating, wrapping around Arthur's throat. "Speak to me!" Arthur yelled, the last remnants of his composure shattering. He slammed his fist onto the oak desk, rattling the Scotch glass. "Cry, scream, beg, do something, you useless, pathetic woman!" The room echoed with his rage. Genevieve merely blinked. Her silence was a mirror reflecting his cowardice, his greed, and his profound lack of class. By refusing to engage, she stripped him of his power. He could not fight an enemy who refused to enter the arena. Breathing heavily, his face flushed with anger, Arthur grabbed his Scotch glass and hurled it against the stone fireplace. It shattered into 100 glittering pieces, raining down on the hearth. "Fine," Arthur snarled, his voice dropping to a vicious whisper. "Have it your way. It is 11 o'clock. You have 1 hour until midnight. If your signature is not on that line by the time the grandfather clock chimes, my mother's doctors will walk through that door. You will be sedated, strapped to a gurney, and locked in a psychiatric ward for the rest of your natural life. And I will forge your signature anyway." He stormed past her, his shoulder clipping hers as he went. He stepped out into the hallway and pulled the heavy mahogany doors shut. Click! The heavy brass deadbolt slid into place. He had locked her in. Genevieve stood perfectly still in the center of the oppressive library. The faint sound of Arthur's footsteps faded down the hall, heading upstairs, toward Clara's bedroom. She was completely alone. The antique grandfather clock in the corner ticked loudly. Tick. Tock. 55 minutes left. Slowly, Genevieve exhaled. The fragile, broken facade she had worn all evening melted away, revealing the cold, calculating one beneath. She did not walk toward the desk. She did not look at the forged documents. Instead, she turned her back on the gold pen, her dark eyes locking onto the shattered glass scattered across the stone hearth of the fireplace. It was time to go to work. The heavy brass deadbolt snapped into place with a definitive hollow echo. Arthur's angry footsteps receded down the hallway, fading into the plush carpets of the west wing, until absolute silence reclaimed the library. Genevieve waited. She stood entirely motionless for 5 full minutes, listening to the vast empty quiet of the house. Then she exhaled. The fragile, broken posture she had maintained for the past 4 hours, for the past 4 years, evaporated. Her spine straightened, losing its submissive curve. The empty, vacant stare in her dark eyes sharpened into something lethal and incredibly focused. She was not a ghost. She was a predator who had been waiting patiently in a cage of her own making. She turned away from the massive oak desk and the forged documents resting upon it. She walked toward the stone hearth, her steps deliberate and entirely silent. The air smelled sharply of the expensive Scotch Arthur had hurled against the stone. Genevieve looked down at the glittering shards of crystal scattered across the soot-stained hearth. With the heel of her dark blue pump, she systematically pushed the broken glass aside, clearing a path to the back wall of the old fireplace. It was a massive 18th century structure built by her great-grandfather. Arthur thought he owned this room, but he did not know its bones. Kneeling on the cold stone, Genevieve reached into the high collar of her dress. Her pale fingers grasped the cold, heavy metal resting against her chest. She pulled the brass skeleton key out from its hiding place. It was a masterfully crafted antique, heavy and dark with age. She ran her thumb over the grooved teeth of the key, then reached into the blackened fireplace. She found a specific brick on the lower left side coated in years of undisturbed ash. Feeling along the mortar line, her fingers found a tiny, nearly imperceptible slot. She inserted the breast key and turned it a quarter inch to the right. A soft mechanical click sounded from deep within the masonry. Genevieve slid the loose brick out of the wall, revealing a dark, rectangular cavity. From the depths of the hidden compartment, she withdrew a small waterproof leather pouch. She set the brick back perfectly into place and sat back on her heels, resting the pouch in her lap. Opening the leather flap, she revealed 2 items. The first was a micro USB drive containing 4 years of meticulously logged financial discrepancies, offshore wire transfers, and proof of Arthur's blatant embezzlement. The second was a heavy silver signet ring bearing the original crest of the autonomous Duchess of Laurent, the ring her father had worn on his deathbed. Staring at the silver crest, the suffocating weight of the past 4 years pressed heavily against her chest. It had started just weeks after her father's sudden tragic passing. Arthur, the charming, supportive husband, had gently suggested she was too emotionally fragile to handle the sprawling Laurent corporate empire. He offered to take the burden temporarily. Then came the quiet, systematic isolation. The loyal estate staff were fired and replaced by Beatrice's spies. Her phone calls were intercepted. Her social circle was carefully curated to believe she was suffering from severe, incurable grief. The true horror began when Beatrice started sending the vitamins to her room. They were heavy sedatives designed to make her vision blur, her words slur, and her mind unravel. They wanted to build a medical history of insanity. They wanted to legally strip her of the autonomous title before she turned 30. Genevieve remembered the cold realization striking her one evening as she stared at her trembling hands. She realized that if she fought back loudly, if she screamed and threw things, she would give them exactly the proof they needed. A hysterical, aggressive woman is easily committed to a psychiatric ward. So she made the most terrifying, painful choice of her life. She stopped fighting. She poured the drug tea into the potted ferns when no one was looking. She swallowed the pills only to spit them into her handkerchief moments later. And she stopped speaking. She let them believe they had successfully broken her mind. She became an invisible piece of furniture in her own home because she was invisible. Arthur and Beatrice grew arrogant. They discussed their financial fraud openly in the sitting room, while she sat blankly by the window. They brought Clara into the house, mocking Genevieve's empty shell right to her face. They handed her the weapon for their own destruction piece by piece, ledger by ledger, and she had quietly recorded it, all waiting for the one night the law would finally be on her side. Her 30th birthday. The moment the original trust fully bypassed their guardianship. The grandfather clock in the corner of the library chimed on the half hour. Bong. 11:30. Genevieve pulled herself out of the memory. The coldness in her eyes solidified into absolute ice. She tucked the silver Laurent ring and the USB drive into the concealed pocket of her dark blue dress. She slipped the brass key back around her neck, feeling its familiar, reassuring weight against her skin. She stood up, brushing a faint smear of ash from her skirt. 30 minutes remained until midnight. 30 minutes until Arthur's guardianship legally expired. She turned around to face the oak desk, her gaze locking onto the forged medical proxy Arthur had left behind. He wanted her signature. He wanted her submission. Genevieve stepped out of the shadows of the fireplace, moving into the dim pool of light cast by the desk lamp. She was done waiting. The minutes dragged like lead weights, pulling the night closer to the precipice of midnight. Genevieve stood perfectly still, beside the massive oak desk in the library, her eyes fixed on the face of the antique grandfather clock. 11:58. The silence in the locked room was absolute, save for the rhythmic mechanical heartbeat of the clock's brass pendulum. Tick, tock. Every swing felt like a hammer striking the final nails into the coffin of the Pendleton family's reign over her life. 11:59. Genevieve closed her eyes. She thought of the 4 years of forced silence, the bitter drug tea she had poured into the soil of houseplants, the mocking laughter of Clara echoing through her own hallways, the cruel patronizing smiles of Beatrice Pendleton as she paraded her sick daughter-in-law in front of high society. They had stolen her 20s. They had stolen her voice. They had tried to steal her mind. But they had not succeeded. The minute hand clicked forward, standing perfectly vertical. Bong. The first chime of midnight vibrated through the floorboards. Genevieve opened her eyes. Bong. She took a slow, deep breath. The suffocating pressure that had lived in her chest for 1,460 days began to lift. Bong. Under the strict stipulations of her father's trust, her 30th birthday marked the absolute termination of all proxy guardianships. The moment the date changed, the legal tether binding her to Arthur Pendleton dissolved into thin air. She was no longer a ward. She was no longer a liability. She was the autonomous Duchess of Laurent. As the 12th and final chime faded into the cavernous quiet of the library, Genevieve reached out and picked up the manila folder Arthur had thrown at her. Arthur had locked the main library doors, completely forgetting, or perhaps too arrogant to care, that the library connected directly to his private study through a secondary heavy oak door. It was a door Genevieve's grandfather had built for discreet meetings. Arthur never used it, preferring the grand ostentatious entrances of the main hall. Genevieve walked over to the connecting door. She turned the brass handle. It yielded effortlessly. She stepped into Arthur's study. The contrast between the two rooms was staggering. While the library was a testament to old money and quiet dignity, Arthur's office was a monument to his own ego. The walls were lined with photographs of him shaking hands with politicians. Magazine covers featuring his fabricated business successes and tasteless modern chrome fixtures that clashed violently with the estate's historic architecture. She walked over to his pristine glass-top desk and placed the manila folder dead center on the leather blotting pad. She flipped it open to the final page, the medical proxy, and the total asset transfer. At the bottom of the page was a single blank line waiting for her signature, under which the name Genevieve Pendleton was printed in bold, commanding letters. Genevieve looked at that name. It felt like a disease. Slowly she raised her left hand. She grasped the heavy gold signet ring bearing the Pendleton crest. It had been slipped onto her finger in a grand cathedral 4 years ago, a cold transaction masquerading as a vow. Her knuckle had swollen slightly over the years. A physical manifestation of her body rejecting the metal. She gripped the ring and pulled. It resisted for a fraction of a second before sliding free, leaving a pale, indented band of skin behind. Her hand felt instantly lighter, as if a boulder had been removed from her wrist. She held the gold ring over the manila folder and let it drop. It landed with a sharp, satisfying clatter, coming to rest precisely on the dotted signature line right above the fabricated name. Arthur had demanded she sign away her life. Instead, she was giving him back his name, leaving him with a worthless piece of paper and a completely empty threat. Genevieve turned her back on the desk and walked out of the study. She moved through the darkened corridors of the West Wing, like a shadow completely silent. She passed the grand staircase. High above on the second floor, she could hear the faint sound of Clara's high-pitched laughter filtering through a bedroom door, followed by Arthur's low voice. They were celebrating their victory. They were celebrating a ghost they thought they had buried. Genevieve felt no anger. Anger was a hot, chaotic emotion, and she was made entirely of ice. She slipped through the side servants' corridor and stepped out the French doors into the freezing autumn night. The air was sharp, biting at her cheeks, but she welcomed the chill. It was in the first breath of true freedom she had taken in years. She walked deliberately across the manicured lawns, her dark blue dress blending into the night, her heels crunching softly against the gravel path leading toward the estate's massive wrought-iron rear gates. Through the creeping morning fog, the silhouette of a sleek black town car emerged. Its headlights were off its engine, idling with a low, expensive purr. As Genevieve approached, the rear passenger door opened. An older man stepped out into the damp chill. He wore a sharp, charcoal overcoat, his silver hair perfectly combed. It was Mr. Harrison, the senior managing partner of the Laurent family's legal firm. He was the only person outside the estate who knew the truth, the only one who had received her heavily encrypted secret letters, smuggled out by a fired maid 2 years ago. He had been waiting for this exact minute. Mr. Harrison looked at her, his sharp eyes taking in her pale face, the dark blue shroud of her dress, and her bare left hand. He gave a low, deeply respectful bow. "Happy birthday, Your Grace," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "Are you ready?" Genevieve stopped. She looked back at the sprawling silhouette of the Pendleton-occupied mansion, the place where they had tried to break her. "I have been ready for 4 years, Mr. Harrison." Genevieve replied, her voice cold, clear, and ringing with absolute authority. Take me to the city. I need to change my clothes before the reading. She slipped into the warm leather interior of the car. The heavy door shut with a solid thud, and the black vehicle melted away into the mist, leaving the Pendleton family to sleep peacefully for the very last time. The Laurent reading room was not merely a conference space, it was a fortress of old money-heavy secrets and absolute authority. Located on the top floor of the city's oldest and most prestigious legal firm, the room was a masterpiece of intimidation. The walls were panelled in dark, rich mahogany lined with oil portraits of the Laurent ancestors, whose cold-painted eyes seemed to judge everyone who entered. Heavy blood-red velvet curtains framed the floor-to-ceiling windows, blocking out the morning sun and casting the long-polished walnut table in a solemn, expensive twilight. By 8:45 in the morning, the room was already suffocatingly full. A dozen of the city's most powerful figures had gathered. They were the senior partners of the law firm, sitting with their hands folded over thick leather folios. There were the key shareholders of Laurent Holdings, a syndicate of older grey-haired billionaires who controlled global shipping real estate and private equity. They murmured quietly among themselves, the sound blending with the rhythmic ticking of the antique bronze clock on the mantel. They were waiting for the mandatory legal transition. Today was Genevieve Laurent's 30th birthday, the day the ironclad trust established by her late father was set to formally bypass all guardianships and grant her total autonomous control. But no one in the room actually expected the Duchess to take the seat at the head of the table. The rumours had been carefully cultivated for years. The board members exchanged knowing, pitying glances. They all believed the narrative. The poor, fragile Laurent heiress had lost her mind to grief, leaving the entire empire in the capable hands of her husband. At exactly 8:50, the double doors swung open. Arthur Pendleton walked into the reading room. He did not walk like a man attending a legal proceeding. He walked like a conquering king claiming his newly won territory. He wore a razor-sharp charcoal suit, a silk tie, and an expression of profound, unshakable confidence. Beside him walked his mother, Lady Beatrice. She was dressed in an impeccable charcoal grey dress, clutching a designer handbag like a scepter. Her chin was tilted upward, her eyes sweeping over the billionaire shareholders, with a thinly veiled look of triumph. They had won. The 4-year war of psychological attrition was finally over. Arthur remembered the profound rush of victory he had felt just a few hours ago. He had woken up to find the library empty. Genevieve was gone. But on his desk, resting precisely on the blank signature line of the medical proxy, was her heavy gold wedding ring. He had laughed aloud in the empty study. He assumed she had finally broken. He believed she had fled into the night, abandoning her title, her fortune, and her dignity rather than face the humiliation of a psychiatric ward. Her disappearance was a minor inconvenience easily solved. With steady hands, Arthur had taken his gold pen and perfectly forged her signature on the bottom line. With her missing, there was no one left to contest it. The doctors would declare her legally incapacitated in absentia, and the empire would permanently become his. Arthur approached the long walnut table, offering solemn practiced handshakes to the board members. "Arthur, my boy," a senior banking executive murmured, leaning in. "Where is the Duchess? We were legally required to expect her." Arthur sighed, a masterful performance of a weary, heartbroken husband. He lowered his voice, ensuring it was just loud enough for the surrounding lawyers to hear. "I am afraid it has been a terrible night, Richard," Arthur said, rubbing his temple. "Genevieve's condition has completely deteriorated. She suffered a severe mental break in the early hours of the morning. She is currently indisposed and under heavy medical supervision. It breaks my heart, but she is entirely unfit to be here." A ripple of sympathetic murmurs travelled down the table. Beatrice dabbed at dry eyes with a lace handkerchief. At the absolute head of the table sat Mr. Harrison. The senior managing partner of the firm was 70 years old, with silver hair and eyes as sharp as cut glass. He did not murmur. He did not offer sympathies. He simply watched Arthur with a face entirely devoid of expression. Arthur stepped up to the head of the table and reached into his leather briefcase. He pulled out the manila folder and placed it squarely in front of the old lawyer. "Mr. Harrison," Arthur said, projecting his voice so the entire room could witness the transfer of power. "I present to you a fully executed medical proxy and a voluntary transfer of asset management, signed by my wife late last night before her collapse. As her legal guardian and designated proxy, I am here to execute the final stipulations of the trust and formally absorbed the Laurent portfolio into Pendleton Management. Mr. Harrison looked down at the folder. He opened it, slowly, his eyes scanning the perfectly forged signature. He did not blink, he did not challenge the ink. He simply closed the folder and rested his hands on top of it. "I see," Mr. Harrison said quietly. His voice was a calm, steady rumble in the tense room. Arthur smirked, adjusting his cuffs. He took the chair immediately to Sir Harrison's right, the seat of the second in command, silently asserting that the head chair was effectively his. Beatrice sat directly behind him, folding her hands in quiet victory. The bronze clock on the mantel clicked softly. Tick-tock. It was 8:59. "Let us dispense with the unnecessary legal theatre, Mr. Harrison," Arthur said, smoothly, leaning back in his leather chair. "The proxy is signed. The board is present. The transition is clear. I ask that you formally recognize the transfer of the autonomous title so that I may return to my wife's bedside." Mr. Harrison looked up at the clock. The long hand settled onto the 12. Bong, the clock struck 9. "Mr. Pendleton." Mr. Harrison began, his tone suddenly shifting from polite neutrality to a chilling razor-sharp formality. "Before we address the validity of any proxy document, the law requires that the primary beneficiary of the Laurent Trust be formally acknowledged upon her 30th birthday." Arthur frowned, a flicker of irritation breaking his confident facade. "I just told you, Mr. Harrison. My wife is mentally incapacitated. She is not here. I am her proxy. Conclude the formalities." Mr. Harrison did not look at Arthur. He looked past him, his eyes lifting toward the back of the room. A faint, ghostly smile touched the corner of the old lawyer's mouth. "You are incorrect, Mr. Pendleton," Mr. Harrison said, his voice carrying the weight of a judge delivering a sentence. "The Duchess is here." At that exact second, the heavy, brass-studded oak doors at the back of the reading room did not just open, they were shoved apart with a violent, echoing crash. The crash of the heavy oak doors hitting the mahogany-paneled walls echoed like a gunshot. The low murmurs of the billionaire shareholders vanished instantly. The scratching of legal pens stopped in mid-stroke. Even the air in the Laurent reading room seemed to freeze, sucked out of the space by the sheer gravity of the woman standing in the doorway. It was Genevieve. But it was not the Genevieve they had been trained to expect. It was not the fragile, broken ghost who had sat silently in the shadows of the ballroom just hours before. The hunched posture, the vacant stare, the somber, dark blue shroud, all of it was gone, left behind in the ruins of her 20s. Standing on the threshold of the reading room was the autonomous Duchess of Laurent, and she looked like a declaration of war. She wore a blood-red power suit. The tailoring was impeccable, cut close to her body, with razor-sharp lines that exuded both immense wealth and lethal precision. The vivid arterial red of the fabric commanded the eye, refusing to be ignored, refusing to blend into the dark woodwork of the room. Her jet-black hair, usually scraped back into a severe submissive bean, fell loose around her shoulders, in sleek, heavy waves, framing the striking diamond shape of her face. Her lips were painted the exact same shade of red as her suit. Her dark, impenetrable brown eyes swept over the room with absolute freezing authority. She did not look crazy, she did not look sick. She looked like she owned the building, the air they were breathing, and the ground beneath their feet. At the head of the table, Mr. Harrison stood up. He did not say a word, but the profound respect in his posture spoke volumes. Following his lead, several of the older lawyers slowly rose to their feet. Arthur Pendleton remained frozen in his chair. All the color drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. His watery blue eyes widened in sheer visceral panic. His mind misfired, struggling to process the impossible reality standing before him. He had just presented a forged document. He had just staked his entire reputation on the lie that she was locked away, lost to a severe mental breakdown. And here, she was radiating a terrifying competence that made his own $1,200 suit look cheap. Directly behind him, Lady Beatrice gasped. The sound was sharp and undignified. The matriarch clutched the pearls at her throat, her perfectly manicured hands trembling as she stared at the woman she had threatened to lock in a psychiatric ward just last night. Genevieve stepped into the room. Click, click, click. The sound of her stilettos striking the hardwood floor was slow, measured, and rhythmic. She did not rush. She did not look around nervously, seeking approval. She walked the length of the long walnut table with the predatory grace of a queen reclaiming her throne. Every billionaire, every banker, every board member watched her. They looked from the vibrant, untouchable women walking past them to the pale, sweating man sitting near the head of the table. The shift in power was not merely psychological. It was a physical weight pressing down on the room. Arthur's survival instinct finally kicked in. Desperation clawed at his throat. If he did not control this narrative right now, he was entirely finished. He pushed his chair back roughly and stood up, forcing a strained, panicked smile onto his face. He stepped into her path, blocking her way to the head of the table. "Genevieve, darling," Arthur said, his voice pitching higher than usual, cracking under the strain. He looked at the board members, attempting an expression of profound, heartbroken concern. "What are you doing here? You are unwell. The doctors said you needed absolute rest. You shouldn't be out of bed." He reached out his hand, moving to grasp her upper arm exactly as he had done in the library the night before. He intended to grip her tight, to physically intimidate her into silence, to drag her out of the room before she could destroy him. Genevieve stopped. She did not flinch away. She did not raise her hands to defend herself. She simply lowered her gaze, fixing her dark eyes on his outstretched hand, as if it were a diseased insect hovering near her silk lapel. The sheer disgust in her stare was so potent that Arthur's hand froze in mid-air inches from her sleeve. Then she spoke. For the board members, who had not heard her voice in years, the sound was a revelation. It was not the weak, reedy voice of a broken woman. It was smooth, perfectly modulated, and as cold as deep ocean ice. "If you touch me, Arthur," Genevieve said quietly, her voice echoing perfectly in the dead silent room, "I will ensure you never have the financial means to wear a tailored suit again." Arthur recoiled as if he had been burned. He stumbled backward, bumping into his own chair. His mouth opened, but no words came out. The illusion of the strong, capable husband shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Genevieve did not wait for a response. She stepped past him, dismissing his entire existence with a single turn of her shoulder. She walked to the absolute head of the table. Mr. Harrison stepped aside, pulling the heavy leather chairman's seat back for her. Genevieve Laurent turned, smoothing the blood-red fabric of her skirt, and sat down. She rested her hands on the polished walnut wood. Her left hand was completely bare. The Pendleton signet ring was gone. She looked down the length of the long table, her gaze pinning Arthur, who was still standing awkwardly, sweating under the collective judging stares of the entire board of directors. "Please, gentlemen, take your seats," Genevieve commanded softly. "It is my 30th birthday. We have a great deal of business to conclude." "This is an absolute outrage." Arthur's voice cracked violently, shattering the silence. He slammed his hand flat against the walnut table, leaning forward in a desperate attempt to reclaim the authority that had just evaporated from his lungs. He looked frantically toward the heavy oak doors, then turned his wild, watery blue eyes toward the senior lawyers. "Security call. Security, immediately." Arthur demanded, his chest heaving under his tailored suit. "My wife is experiencing a severe psychotic episode. She is a danger to herself. She belongs in a medical facility, not a boardroom. Mr. Harrison have her removed." Mr. Harrison did not move. He adjusted his silver-rimmed glasses, looking at Arthur with the mild, detached fascination of a scientist, observing a rat in a maze. "I'm afraid I cannot do that, Mr. Pendleton," the old lawyer said smoothly. "The Duchess is a major shareholder of this firm, and the primary subject of today's proceedings. She has every legal right to be seated at this table." "She is legally incapacitated," Arthur shouted, pointing a trembling finger at the manila folder resting in front of Mr. Harrison. "You have the proxy. You have her signature. I am her authorized guardian." "Are you?" Genevieve's voice cut through the room, quiet, cold, and utterly devastating. She did not raise her voice. She did not stand up. She simply rested her forearms on the polished wood and tilted her head slightly, regarding Arthur, as if he were a particularly slow child. The syndicate of billionaire shareholders, seasoned men who had destroyed empires and survived corporate bloodbaths, watched the exchange with rapt attention. They were not fools. They saw a red-faced, sweating man unraveling at the seams, and they saw a woman composed entirely of ice, radiating absolute, unapologetic power. The narrative of the crazy wife was dying a very fast, very public death. "You are unwell, Genevieve," Beatrice Pendleton suddenly hissed from her chair directly behind Arthur. The older woman's face was pulled tight, her heavily powdered skin stark against her dark dress. "You are confused. You signed those papers last night in the library because you knew you could not handle this. Stop embarrassing yourself and go back to the estate." Genevieve shifted her dark eyes to Beatrice. The matriarch who had whispered threats of straitjackets and padded cells just 12 hours ago instinctively shrank back under the freezing weight of her daughter-in-law's stare. "I did not sign anything, Beatrice," Genevieve said evenly, "though I do commend Arthur's effort. His forgery is quite skilled. I suppose 4 years of signing my checks and liquidating my family's assets gave him plenty of practice." A low, dangerous murmur rippled down the length of the long table. Embezzlement. Forgery. These were not words to be thrown around lightly in the Laurent reading room. Lies? Arthur spotted the sweat now visibly shining on his forehead. "That is a legitimate legal document. She is delusional." Genevieve calmly reached into the pocket of her blood-red jacket. She pulled out a folded piece of paper, a high-quality photocopy she had made at Mr. Harrison's office earlier that morning. She tossed it casually down the table. It slid across the polished walnut, stopping right in front of the senior banking executive. The banker picked it up. It was a photograph of Arthur's private desk taken at exactly midnight. There, resting perfectly on the blank signature line of the medical proxy, was the heavy gold Pendleton wedding ring. "I left you my ring, Arthur," Genevieve said, her tone devoid of any pity. "I gave you back your name. I did not give you my signature." Arthur stared at the photograph in the banker's hands, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. He had thought he was so clever forging the document after he found the ring. He never considered she had documented the scene before walking out the door. But Genevieve was not finished. She stood up slowly, drawing the eyes of every single person in the room. She reached her hand to the collar of her silk blouse and pulled. A delicate silver chain emerged, and hanging at its center was a heavy antique brass skeleton key. When Beatrice saw the key, she let out a strangled, breathless gasp. Arthur physically staggered backward, his legs hitting his chair. For 4 years, they had torn the Laurent estate apart, looking for that key. They had ripped up floorboards, hired a private safe for crackers, and interrogated the staff. It was the master key to the Laurent ancestral vault, the only object that could unlock the original, unalterable trust documents left by her father. And it had been resting against Genevieve's heart the entire time. Without a word, Genevieve turned her back on the board. She walked toward the grand mahogany wall behind her chair. Hidden seamlessly within the wood paneling was a massive flush-mounted steel safe. She inserted the brass skeleton key into the ornate keyhole. Clack, clunk. The heavy mechanical sound of the tumblers falling into place echoed loudly in the silent room. So Genevieve gripped the brass handle and pulled. The heavy steel door swung open smoothly, revealing the darkened interior of the vault. She reached inside and withdrew a thick, leather-bound portfolio. It was sealed with dark, red wax bearing the unbroken crest of the Laurent family. Genevieve walked her back to the head of the table. She dropped the heavy portfolio onto the wood. The thud resonated like a gavel strike. "Mr. Harrison," Genevieve said, maintaining her flawless, terrifying composure. "Break the seal, read the terms of my father's original trust to the board, and let us finally rid my company of parasites." The heavy red wax of the Laurent crest shattered with a sharp, satisfying crack under Mr. Harrison's silver letter opener. The sound was small, yet it echoed through the breathless silence of the reading room like a collapsing bridge. Every billionaire shareholder, every senior partner, and every auditor leaned forward slightly, their eyes locked on the thick parchment as Mr. Harrison unfolded it. Arthur Pendleton stood frozen near the head of the table, his knuckles white, as he gripped the back of his chair. He was no longer the arrogant king of the boardroom. He was a man standing on the trapdoor of a gallows, listening to the executioner read his sentence. Mr. Harrison adjusted his glasses. He did not rush. He savored every single syllable. "I, Julian Laurent, being of sound mind, hereby establish the final stipulations of the Laurent Autonomous Trust." The old lawyer read, his voice resonating with deep, undeniable authority. "Upon the event of her 30th birthday, my daughter Genevieve Laurent shall inherit the title of Autonomous Duchess of Laurent in its entirety. As of midnight on this date, any and all proxy guardianships, marital asset management clauses, or conservatorships are immediately, permanently, and irrevocably void. Beatrice Pendleton let out a small strangled wheeze, sinking heavily into her chair as if her bones had turned to dust. Mr. Harrison looked up from the parchment, his sharp eyes meeting Arthur's terrified gaze. Furthermore, she assumes 100% voting rights over Laurent Holdings, complete control of the estate, and absolute authority over all subsidiary boards. Her power is unencumbered. Mr. Harrison closed the document. The transition is complete. Long live the Duchess. A profound, suffocating silence descended upon the room. The transition of power was absolute. It required no votes. It required no debate. Genevieve Laurent was now the sole owner of the room, the company, and the empire. Genevieve did not smile. She simply reached into the pocket of her blood-red power suit and withdrew the micro USB drive she had retrieved from the fireplace the night before. She slid it smoothly across the walnut table toward the chief financial auditor. Arthur, Genevieve said, her voice piercing the quiet like a blade. For 4 years, you assumed my silence was stupidity. You assumed that because I did not scream, I did not see, but I saw everything. She gestured toward the USB drive. On that drive, gentlemen, you will find meticulous records of every offshore wire transfer, every fabricated consulting fee, and every liquidated asset Mr. Pendleton has siphoned from my family's trust over the past 48 months. It amounts to nearly $80 million. The boardroom erupted in shocked murmurs. The grey-haired billionaires, men who respected nothing but profit and competence, looked at Arthur with absolute undisguised disgust. Embezzlement from a spouse was a scandal. Stealing from the collective board was a death sentence in their world. No. Arthur shouted, his voice cracking in sheer panic. That is a lie. It's fabricated. She is trying to frame me. Genevieve picked up a heavy black fountain pen from Mr. Harrison's desk. I don't need to frame you, Arthur. Your own arrogance did that perfectly. She pulled a stack of pre-drafted legal documents toward her documents she and Mr. Harrison had prepared in the dark hours of the early morning. Effective immediately, Genevieve stated, uncapping the pen. I am stripping you of the title of CEO of Laurent Holdings. Your voting rights are terminated. Your security clearance is revoked. She signed the first document with a sharp, fluid stroke. Arthur gasped, stepping forward, as if to physically stop her pen. But 2 security guards stationed by the door took a synchronized step forward, their hands resting on their radios. Arthur froze. Secondly, Genevieve continued, her voice devoid of any pity as she signed the next page. I am freezing all joint accounts. A forensic audit will begin within the hour. Any properties, vehicles, or luxury goods purchased with stolen funds will be seized by federal authorities. You can't do this, Beatrice shrieked, finally, breaking her paralyzed shock. She jumped out of her chair, her face contorted with rage. We are your family. We took care of you when you were broken. You owe us. Genevieve slowly lifted her dark, freezing eyes to the matriarch. You drugged me, Beatrice. You kept me a prisoner in my own home. The only thing I owe you is the absolute destruction of your social standing. You have 24 hours to vacate the Laurent estate. If you are not gone by tomorrow morning, you will be removed as trespassers. Beatrice staggered backward, clutching her chest, her mouth opening and closing as she realized the horrifying truth. She was homeless. The aristocratic lifestyle she had flaunted was gone in the stroke of a pen. Then Genevieve's gaze drifted past Arthur and Beatrice, settling on the gallery seating at the very back of the room. Sitting in the shadows, waiting to celebrate Arthur's supposed victory, was Clara. The young mistress was pale, her eyes wide with terror. Around her neck, the diamond necklace Arthur had given her the night before caught the dim light glittering like a heavy, sparkling noose. Genevieve held Clara's terrified stare. Clara? She said softly, her voice carrying effortlessly to the back of the room. That necklace you are wearing was purchased on Tuesday using the estate's corporate expense account. It belongs to Laurent Holdings. Take it off, put it on the table, and walk out of my building before I have you arrested for receiving stolen corporate property. Clara trembled violently. She did not look at Arthur for help. She already knew he was a drowning man. With shaking hands, she unclasped the diamonds, practically dropping them onto the nearest empty desk, and fled the reading room, the sound of her heels echoing down the hall in a desperate retreat. Arthur watched his mistress run, He looked at his mother, who was sobbing into her hands. He looked at the billionaires, who had already turned their chairs slightly toward Genevieve, flawlessly aligning themselves with the true power in the room. He was completely, utterly ruined. The aftermath of a corporate slaughter is remarkably quiet. The grey-haired billionaires and senior partners slowly began to pack their leather briefcases. They lingered, their sharp eyes locked on the spectacle unfolding at the head of the walnut table. They had spent decades orchestrating hostile takeovers, but rarely had they witnessed a destruction so complete, so elegantly executed, and so deeply personal. Arthur Pendleton stood completely paralyzed. The adrenaline that had fueled his arrogant entrance had evaporated, leaving behind a cold, sickening terror. His mind raced, calculating the velocity of his downfall. The frozen accounts, the forensic audit, the $80 million he could never replace. He did not have the funds to hire a defense attorney. He did not even have the funds to call a cab. Federal prison was no longer a vague, abstract threat. It was a concrete room waiting for him by the end of the week. He looked at the security guards standing like stone statues near the heavy oak doors. He looked at Mr. Harrison, who was carefully organizing the newly signed executive orders. Finally, his bloodshot eyes settled on the woman in the blood-red suit. Genevieve sat in the high-backed chairman's seat, her posture relaxed but immaculate. He was not gloating. She did not wear a triumphant, theatrical smirk. She simply watched him with the chilling clinical detachment of a surgeon examining a tumor that had just been successfully excised. The sheer reality of his ruin finally broke the last remaining pillar of Arthur's ego. His legs gave out. The heavy thud of his knees hitting the polished hardwood floor echoed sharply through the reading room. A collective breath was drawn by the remaining board members. The man who had walked into the room demanding a crown was now groveling on the floor. Genevieve! Arthur choked out, his voice cracking violently. Real tears spilled over his eyelashes, streaming down his pale, sweating face. He crawled forward slightly, reaching out to grasp the edge of the walnut table, though he dared not touch her red skirt. Genevieve, please! Please, you cannot do this to me! You cannot send me to prison! Genevieve looked down at him. She did not move. She let his pathetic, desperate sobbing fill the silence. I was desperate, Arthur pleaded, his words tumbling out in a rushed, frantic whisper. The pressure of running the empire, the stress of the board. I made mistakes. I know I made terrible mistakes, but I did it because I was trying to keep us afloat. Please, Genevieve. We have been married for 4 years. We are husband and wife. You know me. You know I am a good man beneath all of this. Have mercy on me. At the mention of their marriage, the temperature in the room plummeted. Genevieve slowly leaned forward, resting her forearms on the table. The dark, impenetrable abyss of her eyes locked onto his watering, panicked gaze. Do not insult my intelligence, Arthur, she said, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet register. And do not dare invoke the sanctity of a marriage you treated as a hostage situation. A good man does not lock his wife in a dark library. A good man does not poison her tea with sedatives to steal her inheritance. A good man does not flaunt a mistress in the very house his wife's grandfather built. I am sorry, Arthur wailed, abandoning all dignity. He bowed his head, his tears splashing onto the pristine hardwood floor. I swear to you I am so sorry. I will pay back every cent I will leave the city. Just call off the federal auditors. Please. I am begging you on my knees. Genevieve stared at the top of his head. She felt absolutely nothing. There was no lingering affection to mourn, no lingering fear to overcome. He was utterly pathetic. You are not sorry for what you did to me, Arthur, she said with devastating clarity. You're only sorry that the woman you thought was blind was actually keeping the receipts. She stood up smoothly, her chair sliding back silently. She towered over him, a vision of untouchable authority in crimson. I told you last night when you gave me an hour to sign my life away that you had no idea who I was. Genevieve continued, her voice resonating through the silent room. At midnight I took off your ring. I left it on your forged document. I gave you back your name, Arthur. Along with all your debts, your lies, and your cowardice. You do not get to claim the privileges of a husband when you have already been fired as an employee. She turned her gaze to the 2 imposing security guards waiting near the doors. She gave them a single sharp nod. The guards stepped forward instantly. They grabbed Arthur by the shoulders of his ruin-tailored suit and hauled him to his feet. He screamed, thrashing wildly, his expensive shoes scrambling uselessly against the polished floor. Genevieve, please don't do this, Genevieve. His pathetic cries echoed down the hallway as the guards dragged him out of the reading room, the sound fading into the distance, until the heavy oak doors swung shut, cutting him off completely. Beatrice Pendleton remained in her chair, paralyzed. The haughty, terrifying matriarch looked suddenly small, ancient, and completely hollowed out. She stared at the empty space on the floor where her golden son had just been weeping. Genevieve did not spare her mother-in-law a single glance. "Mr. Harrison," Genevieve said, turning back to the senior lawyer, her voice perfectly calm, as if she had merely asked for a glass of water. "Ensure Lady Pendleton is escorted off the premises. Then I believe it is time we brief the board on our projections for the next quarter." The transition of power within the Laurent reading room was not a loud explosion. It was the quiet, undeniable shift of tectonic plates. For the next hour, Genevieve directed the board meeting with a terrifying, flawless competence. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She outlined the immediate restructuring of the subsidiary boards, the appointment of an interim financial oversight committee, and the systematic purging of every executive Arthur had hired during his fraudulent tenure. The grey-haired billionaires, men who had spent the previous night clinking champagne glasses and mocking her, as an empty shell, now sat in absolute reverent silence. They took notes. They nodded in fervent agreement. When she spoke, they listened as if their very livelihoods depended on her every syllable, because as of 9 o'clock this morning they did. She had not merely taken a seat at the table, she had bought the entire room. When the agenda was concluded, Genevieve closed the leather portfolio resting in front of her. "That will be all for today, gentlemen. The transition teams will contact your offices by noon. Good morning." The board members stood up in unison. There were murmurs of, "Yes, Your Grace," and "Brilliant strategy, Your Grace." One by one, the titans of industry bowed their heads slightly as they filed out of the heavy oak doors, eager to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of the Pendleton family. Soon the grand mahogany room was empty, save for Genevieve and Mr. Harrison. The old lawyer finished packing the signed executive orders into his battered leather briefcase. He clicked the brass locks shut and looked down the length of the walnut table at the woman in the blood-red suit. The stern clinical mask of the senior partner finally melted, replaced by a warm, deeply genuine smile. "I have served this firm for 40 years, Your Grace," Mr. Harrison said, his voice thick with a quiet, profound pride. "And I can say without a shadow of a doubt that your father would have been utterly in awe of you today." Genevieve looked at the empty chair where Arthur had sat then, at the spot where Beatrice had crumbled. The ghosts of her 4-year imprisonment seemed to evaporate into the dust motes dancing in the air. "Thank you, Mr. Harrison," she said softly, "for keeping my secrets, for waiting in the dark with me." "It was the honor of my career, Genevieve," he replied, dipping his head. "The estate is secure. The authorities have already frozen Arthur's passports and accounts. You never have to look at them again." Genevieve stood up. The heavy brass skeleton key rested warmly against her collarbone. "Then I suppose it is time to go home." She walked out of the reading room, her heels clicking rhythmically against the hardwood floor. She bypassed the private, secluded elevators Arthur always insisted on using, opting instead for the grand glass elevator that descended through the center of the firm's towering lobby. As the glass box glided downward, the morning sun broke through the city's skyline, pouring through the massive windows of the building. The golden light washed over her, illuminating the vivid crimson of her suit and the sleek dark waves of her hair. When the elevator doors chimed open into the main lobby, the bustling noise of the corporate floor instantly hushed. Dozens of lawyers, clerks, and executives stopped in their tracks. They parted like the Red Sea, creating a wide, clear path for her. They had already heard the whispers. They knew the tyrant was gone, and the true Duchess had returned. Genevieve walked through the sea of people with her head held high. She did not gloat. She did not smile. She wore her dignity like impenetrable armor, her presence commanding absolute respect. She stepped through the heavy revolving glass doors and out onto the bustling city street. The crisp autumn air hit her face, smelling of fallen leaves, cold pavement, and total unadulterated freedom. The morning sun was dazzlingly bright, forcing the shadows of the past 4 years to finally retreat. Parked at the curb was the sleek black town car bearing the Laurent crest. The driver, a man who had served her father for 2 decades before Arthur fired him, was standing by the open rear door. He beamed at her, tears shining in his eyes. Welcome back, Your Grace, the driver said, his voice shaking with joy. Genevieve stopped beside the open door. She raised her left hand, letting the bright morning sunlight hit her bare ring finger. The pale indentation where the Pendleton crest had strangled her for 4 years was already beginning to fade. She traced the smooth skin with her thumb. She had not just survived the humiliation, she had not just endured the betrayal, she had weaponized her own silence, allowed her enemies to build their castles on a foundation of lies, and then she had simply pulled the legal deed out from under them. She had won without raising her hand, without shedding a tear, and without ever losing her humanity. Genevieve lowered her hand and smiled. It was a small, quiet smile, but it held the warmth of a woman who had finally stepped entirely into the light. "Take me to the estate, Thomas," Genevieve said, sliding into the luxurious leather interior. "I have a house to redecorate." The heavy door closed with a solid, satisfying thud. The black car pulled seamlessly into the morning traffic, leaving the ruins of the Pendleton name far behind, lost forever in the rearview mirror.